few days ago, I decided to rewatch the Benatar-Peterson debate from a couple of months back. Big mistake, me doing that. And going in, I knew that it would be a big mistake, but I still did it. Don't ask me why. Ended up being a mistake because it led to me recording this right now, which I know is fruitless. Doing a video on something that annoys you is always fruitless, because as frustrating as the debate was on the first listen, was much worse on the second listen. And before I get into the main thrust of that, I do need to take a few minutes to try and eliminate a blatant dodge that I haven't seen called out by anyone. And it's the sort of dodge that's been lingering for ages, and it'll just not die. People keep appealing to this crap, and I'm sick of it. And it has to do with the growing number of people who are brand spanking new, not just to suffering-focused ethics, but to ethics in the broad sense, and certainly to procreative ethics. And it couldn't be any more clear that they are new to the idea that something like procreation can even be called into question, much less booed off the stage. You see it in the way they'll try to neutralize certain harms as harms to be overcome, aka harms that should have manifested in the first place. Whereas the sort of harms that they disapprove of, the harms that a spirited preventionist might inflict on others in an effort to prevent something far worse, well, those aren't the sort of harms that we can say it's good to overcome in life. So we can't lump them into that pile, we'll lump them into the other pile, the pile that ought not to have manifested. So, for instance, it's not good to have to overcome a public policy that you disapprove of, but it's good to have to overcome all these other amorphous harms that come along with living the good life. Just unabashedly stacks the deck against the opposing view, the stuff that they don't like. And it's transparent as hell, and they don't even seem to realize it. And I've noticed that there's been an uptick in this sort of bad will or ineptitude or whatever it is. There's been an uptick since the Benatar-Peterson debate, if you want to call it that. I think that debate provided the groundwork for the sort of special pleading and the chicanery that I just went over, essentially. I knew the debate would go badly and make the outsider double down on that sort of special pleading, but I wasn't prepared for just how badly the aftermath went, in the sense that you had lots of overcomers who were energized by Peterson's dot connections, which are supposed to, illuminate the implications of believing the wrong things, namely things that converge on anti-natalism, or any other more modestly negative verdicts when it comes to baby making. So there's a danger to believing that, according to Peterson, and that danger is it stems from taking the logic of prevention to its obvious conclusions, no matter how uncomfortable those may be. Example he uses is a worn-out example, because of course it is. He tasks Benatar with explaining what's wrong with killing a person who is off the grid and who has no social or familial ties, killing the person painlessly in his sleep. Because in doing so, well, we spare that person much pointless suffering. So I've actually used and probably overused that example myself some years ago, but I didn't do it in an effort to cast aspersions on anything that touches on procreation per se. But this crowd is really bent on believing that it does touch on procreation, or at least to any position that strives to stonewall procreation. And I think Benatar did a substandard job of explaining why it's just a stock gotcha and why it fails. We can talk about dispositional interests and how they differ from non-dispositional interests, which is to say potential interests. But that's not going to register, I don't think. I've sort of felt out this crowd and talking about actual versus potential, talking about uniquely realizable versus non-uniquely realizable persons. All of that is a brick wall approach. They're not going to get it. And it's actually difficult when you get into, like the stuff on population ethics, all these different views under the banner of person-affecting views, like comparativism, actualism. It's not the sort of debate you can just have on the fly. It needs to be a debate in written form, and that's not what we're doing right now. So it's probably, if we're going to talk about extemporaneous discourse, it's above all of our pay grade. Luckily, you don't even have to sell anyone on any of that because there are better reasons. The words you're looking for in terms of why not kill the person who's off the grid, the words you're looking for are words like respect, humility, a fundamental respect for others, for their wishes. That's a cornerstone of moral philosophy. And there's no way to respect non-extant wishes, intangible wishes. There's no way to do it unless you're prepared to say that we are constantly disrespecting a super majority of non-extant wishes by never letting them manifest into extant wishes. There have been countless uniquely realizable individuals who never materialized. And this trend will continue. Only an infinitesimally tiny percent of potential persons will be born. The rest will remain unborn. And it will not worsen anything. It won't worsen the state of affairs, nor will it be bad for all those uniquely realizable individuals who remained unconceived. Because whatever is at stake in those cases is fuzzy at best. Whereas with tangible wishes, proven wishes, actual wishes, dispositional wishes, it's much easier to pull off respectfulness and humility. So all things considered, critics of procreation have nothing to gain, ethically speaking, by disrespecting dispositional wishes of others. You don't disrespect others and their wishes so as to save them from their fates, however bad those fates may be. You don't discontinue someone, even if that someone is friendless, familyless, even if they're suicidal. And this means that we include the person who actually wants to die, and who you know they want to die, and they just can't wait to finally muster up the brass to off themselves, but they want to die by their own hand. They don't want you to kill them. They don't want anyone else to kill them. They want to go out on their own terms, not by your hand. And that's all the reason you need not to kill them. But that's not convincing to the newcomer, it would seem. Certainly wasn't convincing to Peterson in that debate with Benatar. So a newcomer like Peterson hears anti-natalists cite these various reasons, some of which are derivative, reasons for why the killing shouldn't be done, and still insists that there's a logical disconnect in refusing to do so, at least once we set aside those derivative reasons for not doing it. On the face of it, I can't fully blame newcomers, because Benatar has these multiple asymmetries, and they're not all that straightforward. It gets very muddy the deeper you read into it, and it's a dry read on top of that. A PR fail, essentially. So if a conventional type zeroes in on any of those asymmetries single-handedly, then it's understandable how that alone will stick in their head, and it'll drown out all the other separations that come after. Separations about initiating and discontinuing lives. And instead of bothering with any of those technical bits, I say, don't bother. The next best move is actually turning the tables on whoever you're talking to. Because two can play at that game. The game of, follow the implications of your core values to their bitter end. And I've never seen a single anti-natalist flip the script in this way, even though the script is easily flippable. Basic example, physician-assisted suicide. Tragic case of Jack Kevorkian, being imprisoned for helping people who wanted to die as gracefully as possible, die as gracefully as possible. This landed Kevorkian in the slammer from 1999 till 2007, 8 long years. But I suppose we can be told that a miscarriage of justice on that level is just another one of those things that you have to overcome in life. So it was good that Kevorkian went to prison because Kevorkian got to overcome prison. And life's about overcoming obstacles. Right? So let me ask you, is that a consequence of some non-belief, or is it a consequence of belief? No, it's a consequence of belief. Kevorkian went to prison because people believed certain things. So if the beliefs of anti-natalists are dangerous, we can see that, certain other beliefs are even more dangerous. just as the worst interpretations of pessimism don't exist in a vacuum and can have negative impact in the real world, so too can the worst interpretations of your whatever, your fill in the blank view. Right? So whatever your specific affirmative view is, it doesn't exist in a vacuum either. And it has a worst possible interpretation. And one of those warped interpretations is the belief that miscarriages of justice are meant to be overcome, so bring them on. Bring on more of it. It's never enough. So you see how that works against you as well. Standing in the way of assisted suicide is the mirror image of partaking in killing to prevent suffering. The case that the anti-natalist has to explain away, apparently. Except it's far worse in the case of euthanasia because it's actually happening on a wide scale. Whereas the violation of interest in the example Peterson was concerned with, well, that's purely hypothetical. The violation of interest in the Kevorkian type cases, well, those are manifesting all the time. So if you're looking for something to worry about on practical grounds, look no further than the case of assisted suicide. Start with the non-hypothetical thwarting of interests. But the overcomers are not doing that, are they? And why aren't they doing it? Well, I imagine because it's easier to just stack the deck. And I'm not even pointing to the worst things here, because the particular topic is far more tragic than even the Kevorkian case. The moment you apply a global overview and ask, well, what of all the nations that have functioning medical systems with the requisite tools to help people die in the civilized manner that they wish to die in? How many nations and their peoples actually allow for the procedure to be a simple agreement between the patient and the doctor? The doctor death. How many? Turns out not that many. And the beacon of Western civ gives us slogans like Dr. Death, well, then you can imagine just how poorly a Muslim majority country handles this. But realistically, all countries botch the issue to one level or another, because the few countries that have legalized access have only done so for the terminally ill. And last I checked, those 3 countries that make some exceptions for non-terminal cases, those being Luxembourg, Belgium, and Netherlands, they've gone a step further and granted more leeway. But aside from that, it's just a few countries with massive hoop jumping even for the terminally ill. So if you're going to tell me that anti-natalists, that they can't wash their hands clean of murder in the name of prevention, well, you invite the sort of comeback that says you can't either when it comes to all the barbaric and sadistic crap done in the name of life affirmation and survival. Because what do you suppose is the driving force, ideologically speaking, of that unwillingness to let people who are terminally ill, to let them go out on their own terms? Well, we know what the driving force is. We hear things like, it promotes a culture of death. Oh, but that's not meddlesome, I suppose. No one's supposed to be worried about that. No, it's a mirror image of the sort of meddlesomeness that Jordan did his best to over-worry about, and to box in anti-natalism or some other near-aligned view, to say that that's the only consistent path forward, to perform mercy killings on those who want to live, because to live is to live badly. So if I have to give in to those, I'm going to call them associative tactics, fear tactics. If I have to give in to them, then you have to give in as well. Just honestly consider how many terminally ill people with one foot in the grave, have no access to euthanasia across both the developed and the developing world especially. I can attribute that to a culture of life. And then I can say I just checkmated the idea that the implications of natalism are necessarily benign, or at least more benign, such that anti-natalism poses a unique problem here. If we make it about things that are action guiding, Moral philosophies which are meant to be action guiding, which is a different argument altogether. They need not be. The implications of natalism or any other view that's closely aligned to it. Now, as it happens, I do know a fair number of people who are closely aligned with natalist views and who don't have any issues with the terminally ill, or anyone else, for that matter. Anyone else who has no dependents being given legally recognized right to die. That's what they believe. And I'm glad to know it, but I can still play dumb when I hear them say this. I can say to them, well, you're not speaking earnestly, or you're ignoring the logical implications of what it means, right? What it means to quote unquote value life. If you say it's okay for the terminally ill to choose when they want assisted suicide, I can do all that stuff and more. Or I can stop being a prick and just take them at their word. And the same with people who ended up backing Peterson in this debate. And if you're in the Peterson camp, you are not, despite your nebulous claims about valuing life, whatever the fuck that's supposed to mean in the end, right? You are not driven by a catch-all commitment to make every single living person live for as long as humanly possible, just because you think life is, on the whole, good enough. No. Things can get in the way of that. Things like respect. You respect the wishes of the terminally ill far more than you quote-unquote value life. If you see how this makes sense, you should be able to see how a generic anti-natalist can likewise respect the wishes of a person who would like to remain alive, or even a suicidal person who very much wants to die despite not wanting to be killed by another person. Both camps can recognize and internalize the sharp difference between moral and prudential value. And that's what this comes down to. It's differences between the moral and the prudential. And in light of those differences, both camps can hold that individuals should not be relegated to mere repositories of value and disvalue. So we need to get that right off the bat straightened out. Problem is, the block of people who are happy to barricade options like euthanasia are proportionally larger by leaps and bounds than the block of anti-natalists who are willing to bite the bullet, the so-called bullet, and who do actually believe that mercy killings of the non-suicidal are justifiable because they view it as logically combinational with anti-natalism simpliciter. And I'm not just talking disproportionality in terms of total numbers of the two camps. I'm talking disproportionality per capita. Religious fanatics tip the scales on this one more than anyone would like to admit. So it's entirely one-sided. The fraction of anti-natalists who might be willing to pose some danger by being meddlesome in that way doesn't even come close to matching the fraction of meddlesome natalists and their closely aligned cohorts. Prohibiting euthanasia is just one example of this meddlesomeness. It's an easy example in the sense that I can picture someone like Peterson not biting the bullet on that and outright admitting that people should have a right to die. Maybe I'm wrong, and who knows, I haven't seen any videos with him where he clarifies his position on that. Presumably because he doesn't really care about it all that much. And as a side note, this influx of why I love Jordan Peterson videos, that's still going strong. If you go to these people's channels and you scan their content, not a single one of them has any videos on the right to die or anything that closely touches on that subject. So am I to conclude that they would side with the prohibitions based on that lack of content? No, that'd be a hasty move. And not just hasty, it would be patently weaselly to try and paint Peterson out as someone who is unwilling to, quote, follow the logical implications of his reverential take on life to its uncomfortable ends, all because he's presumably okay with some individuals not living for as long as humanely possible. But by the same token, generic anti-natalists can hold that it's fine for non-suicidal individuals to live for as long as humanly possible, or even beyond humanly possible, all else being equal. Right? So even if we get extropianism going strong, which is a strand of transhumanism, If extropianism comes to be a practical thing that's on the policy table, by all means, generic anti-natalist does not have any objections to it per se. But here's the kicker. What happens if tomorrow Peterson wakes up in a world where all individuals who are capable of reproducing wish to make use of assisted suicide? If he had the power to stop it, would he allow those voluntary deaths to take place legally with the aid of physicians, or would he morph into another meddlesome natalist? See, there, I think he would do the latter. Because like he said in the debate, the survival of the species trumps all. He's a survivalist first and foremost. The overriding interest is that of humanity as the group, and its grouped survival. Now you tell me how far you take that, assuming you agree with it. Assuming you're a survivalist. Someone who holds that the interests of persons are derivative to those of the species, and not the other way around. If outlandish scenarios about mercy killings are fair game, well then how about an outlandish scenario where all fertile women across the world suddenly decide to go child-free? Not necessarily for ideological reasons, just for personal reasons. Now some of it might be down to ideological or philosophical reasons, but that's neither here nor there. A lion's share of those women would be motivated non-ideologically. So say you have a guarantee that this is just a rough patch, and that if you could just push through to the next generation, things would restore back to normal. So it's just a handful of generations of women who are causing all the problems for your survivalist project. What would you do if you had dictatorial powers to forcibly impregnate just enough of those females so as to bring about the next generation of babies who would eventually turn into the sort of adults who would desire to restore things back to sanity by procreating again? Would you forcibly impregnate a large enough chunk of those women who insist on remaining child-free? And let's stipulate that all else remains the same. So the kids would be brought up decently, there would be no civil war that would break out, no international wars would break out as a result of you having deemed it necessary to forcibly impregnate thousands, if not tens of thousands of women. All would be forgiven by everyone except the women themselves, but ultimately things would go back to normal. So we'd be looking at a nasty trade-off, but surely it'd be a justifiable trade-off at the end, under any life-affirming view, because it's short-term pain for long-term gain, and because the interests of the potential matter as much as the interest of the actual, which he squarely said at one point during the debate. I mean, if you cheer on a guy who says that the extinction of humanity is the worst thing that could possibly happen, well then what's a few bitches being coerced into having a bun in the oven for a few months? Now, plus you can always remind them that overcoming forcible impregnation is what life's all about. Just one of these many things to overcome. So again, if you wouldn't do it, if you hold that doing something like that would be worse than humanity going extinct, okay, but you are mistaken if you think the natalist majority agrees with you worldwide. That's why I view the anti-natalism implies murder claim as a monumental farce. There's a philosophical doctrine out there that should concern you as an individualist. It's the sort of doctrine that places as its master imperative survival of the human species. By any means necessary, this nebulous value contained within the species gets to override the disvalue of individual collateral damage. Now you tell me, who's got the more dangerous ideas? One thing, as I'm listening to these two, re-listening to their debate, one thing I'd love to get an idea of is how either of them would reply to this additional layer of this debate that I've actually never heard Benatar make. I've touched on it a few times in the past. It's been ages since I've touched on it. But I'd especially like to see how Peterson would handle the objection of natalism that finds its roots in the recognition of natalism's kinship to the intellectual bankruptcy of arranged marriages. Now, of course, there's different degrees of arranged marriages. Some are straightforwardly forced. Others are forced to a less degree. Couples may have their hand twisted on these non-legal grounds, but nothing legal. So I'm going to appeal to the legal analogy because clearly, in the case of the parent-child relationship, the child legally belongs to the parent. So under the arranged marriage scheme, the contracted relationship, if we're going to call it that, it comes in the form of husband and wife, and both parties, if it's truly forced legally, well, they have little to no say in the contrived union. Under the natalism scheme, it's the parent-child relationship that's subject to the, I guess we can say, the residential union under the law. So under both schemes, the initial stages of the relationship are equally unearned and contrived. Now, do arranged marriages necessarily lead to matrimonial horror? Now, of course they don't. The two individuals who are slated to live together, well, they can easily turn out to be perfect for each other. But this doesn't apply that people who, let's say people who are huge fans of the West, now it doesn't mean that they ought to go back to judging the insanity of arranged marriages according to the happenstance of its success rate. And I would argue the same applies to the familial ties that are implicit in the actualization of natalist practice. Right? So we know that the coming few decades will see a number of kids whose lives will be supervised by their parents, and in the worst cases, their lives will be micromanaged from dusk to dawn by their parents. And many of those minors will hear these tactical ultimatums like, as long as you live under my roof, you'll do as I say. And the ever popular, well, you'll thank me for this when you're older, which I've called, in the past, I've called a special brand of parental clairvoyance, because the parent is all too often under the impression that they have a little Miss Cleo in them, as it pertains to what the minor is going to feel in the future. Whereas the rare honest parent will actually simply just tell the youngster, well, who the hell knows? You might just thank me for this when you're older, but I really have no idea, and it's all conjecture. But the point is, that's the same sort of conjecture that these vestigial practices, usually across the non-Western sections of the world, that justify arranged marriages. Like, it's often assumed that the young couple will be maybe not perfectly right for each other, but just right enough, and that's going to be enough to justify the practice. Or in the worst case, a parent might bite the bullet even if the two individuals, the two families may bite the bullet even if the two individuals are just absolutely incompatible from A to Z. If it's tradition, the two families will insist on going through with a forced arranged marriage. And I would say that is the equivalent of the sort of natalist who would say that even if I know a given child of mine will regret being born, I'm still going to go through with the pregnancy and the birth because, by golly, it's my body, or something to that effect. That's the worst. The worst of the worst is even if it's an inevitability in an individual case where you show them some sort of a forecast where it says, assume for the sake of thought experiments that it's inevitable that your child will regret being born, and the worst sort of procreator will say, even in that case, I'll go through with it because I'm going to do what I'm going to do. There's a close enough analogy to the arrogance of people who believe that the forced arranged marriage is justified in the name of tradition. So, and I have to talk about the final segments where the two of them have their final say, because Benatar was the recipient of a cheap shot and he just took it lying down. And it's not like he didn't have a chance to respond, because in Benatar's final say, in Peterson's final say, he went first and Benatar went second. So Benatar had a chance to address the existential cowardice attribution on the part of Peterson, and he didn't. Like, Peterson went on this 5-minute spiel as his final say, and Benatar went on like a less than a minute spiel for his final say. But essentially, Peterson said that the Benatar view reduces to a form of existential bias, the belief itself. Now, it's funny to hear a psychologist do this, blend the belief to the disposition, because there's been so much research that's come out and found that people exhibit attribution biases when they interpret not only the behavior of others, but the beliefs of others, right? And especially in relation to in-group versus out-group members on the basis of belief. Not just basis of lifestyles, but on the basis of beliefs as well. Worldviews, outlooks. Review of the literature on these intergroup attribution biases find that people will favor dispositional accounts of an in-group member's positive behavior, and then they'll favor situational accounts of an in-group's negative behavior, an in-group member's negative behavior. And contrast to how they rate the behavior of out-group members. Well, surprisingly enough, they do the opposite. An out-group member, they will attribute the positive behavior to situational factors and the negative behavior to dispositional factors. How self-serving. And that's precisely what Peterson does when he takes this cheap shot. It just tends to favor what flatters his ideological in-group. And, well, I can play the same game as I'm showing with this little up-down diagram, because one can just say that he's an existential masochist with his obsession with the noble sufferer. Or I could say existential Stockholm syndrome. I can do all this and more. And I have in rule number 7 from the last video where I plugged the post on the 12 rules for analytical life. So these findings do have crucial implications for understanding psychology in general. And psychology, especially in the sort of stuff Peterson talks about, the development and the persistence of outgroup stereotypes. So on one hand, he's this big, he battles against this hyperpolarization, but then towards a debate like this, he does something that totally ignores that there is such a thing as attribution biases, and he plays right into them. Now, in fairness, these things are observed very early on, and because of that, because there's so few things in the culture at large, in the part of schooling that points them out, it's hard to get over it once you're sort of mired in it. It ties into something that's called the actor-observer asymmetry. So I'll just take a shot from the wiki article on this, and I'll read a bit from it, because I think it's important to pin it down, because people never go to the links, so I'm going to stop leaving links, and I'm just going to read a bit from the pages that I'm referencing. So it says, actor-observer asymmetry, also known as the actor-observer bias, explains the errors that one makes when forming attributions about the behavior of others. When people judge their behavior, and they are the actor, they are more likely to attribute their actions to the particular situation than to a generalization about their personality. Yet when an observer is explaining the behavior of another person, they are more likely to attribute this behavior to the actor's overall disposition rather than to situational factors. This frequent error shows the bias that people hold in their evaluations of behavior. Because people are better acquainted with the situational, that is to say external factors affecting their own decisions, they are more likely to see their own behavior as affected by the social situation they are in. However, because the situation effects of another's behavior are less accessible to the observer, observers see the actor's behavior as influenced more by the actor's overall personality. The actor-observer asymmetry is a component of the ultimate attribution error. Sometimes the actor-observer asymmetry is defined as the fundamental attribution error, which is when people tend to focus on the interpersonal characteristic or disposition as a cause of a behavior rather than the external factors or situational influences. Right, so in this article they talk mostly about behavior, but I would add belief as well, because people do it, I think now more, especially with the internet and social media. People apply this crap to beliefs far more than behavior, because they don't get to see behavior firsthand. They just see people spouting off about their beliefs. Now, in fairness, I should point out that plenty of people who backed Benatar in this debate, they're no strangers to this actor-observer bias, because they will also, though not as vociferously, but they will, when they're in their own circle jerks, point out that the only reason anyone can possibly disagree with them is because they can't handle the truth. And, well, that's almost as bad as the charge Peterson made. Right? It's that sort of caricature that I appealed to in that diagram. It's to accuse someone of being an existential escapist is no different than accusing someone of being an existential masochist. You're not arguing the argument. You may argue the argument as a slogan, but you're not staying true to it. You are quick to assume that the only way someone can disagree with you is because what you believe is so damn difficult to not only accept, but to live with on a day-to-day basis. And that's just not true. There's a lot of people who think that iconoclastic beliefs aren't in some way fun to have. And I think if you're honest with yourself, you'll see that they clearly are. There's an element of them, maybe they're not fun from A to Z, but there's certainly an element where it's fun, where you get to go around exposing people to brand new views they've never heard before. And knowing that on some level, you're rattling them. Anyone who says there's not a fun element to that is, well, either being intellectually dishonest or is far removed from knowing themselves. And I think I'll end it on that.